Imagine a failed state, and a small handful of world nations come to mind. Somalia might be the most common answer, a nation so weak and corrupt that it's never more than a few inches from total collapse. Nations like Sudan or Libya certainly merit discussion, split apart by warring factions with little hope of reintegration. We could talk about Myanmar, Yemen, or the Congo, nations that have proved utterly incapable of beating back insurgencies and completely uninterested in the well-being of their people. Or we could talk about Haiti, a place where the failed state label might not fit only because it somehow undersells how apocalyptic the situation there has truly gotten. But one nation that might not seem like a candidate for the list is the country of Nigeria, the most populous nation in Africa and the sixth most populous in the world. Nigeria has 236 million residents, and they've watched their country develop into one of the most powerful economies in Africa, a leader on the continent, and an ambassador for African ambition on the global stage. Rich in history, vibrant in culture, Nigeria doesn't outwardly seem as if it could be teetering on the edge of failure. But what doesn't make headlines are the battles, the overlapping insurgencies, and the seemingly incessant massacres that are driving Nigeria to the brink. This is Nigeria's ongoing and rapidly deteriorating security crisis and the mad dash to failed statehood that the entire world seems to be ignoring. All across the globe, it's rare to find a nation that's dealing with a security crisis but doesn't seem to have any other problems. Far more often, violence goes hand in hand with corruption, exploitation, poverty, repression, or any number of other factors, usually overlapping to create a much larger state of chaos where violent actors can thrive. The nation of Nigeria is no different, and before we can get into the several security crises that Nigeria is facing at once, we've got to take a moment and set the scene. As we do, it's really important to give a bit of credit because Africa's most populous nation does have quite a few things going for it. The Nigerian economy is recovering from recent instability, and it's expected to continue growing for the foreseeable future. Sanitation and electricity access are improving rapidly in many parts of the nation. Infant mortality and overall poverty rates are dropping, and the country's human development metrics are increasing year over year. But like so many other parts of the world, Nigeria's outwardly positive indicators of progress only tell a part of the larger story. As of 2024, a full 56% of Nigerians lived below the national poverty line, equivalent to about 129 million people, with poverty rates especially high in the north and rural areas, which are, in turn, the areas we'll be coming back to when we discuss the nation's many insurgencies. Food insecurity is common, economic opportunity is scarce, inflation is high, and the nation's population is very young, with 2/3 of Nigerians being under the age of 25 at a time when jobs for young people are increasingly scarce. The nation's government is stunning in its corruption at all levels of governance and in all branches, while efforts to hold elites accountable almost never get any real traction. Vote buying and patronage networks are common, police are known for frequently engaging in extortion, and life for women and girls across the country is particularly harsh. Even on metrics where Nigeria is overall doing fairly well, its people live in a situation of pervasive inequality. Things are not better for everyone, they're getting better for some people and worse for others. But when progress and suffering are quantified, the average does tend to show progress, making it all the easier to overlook tens of millions of people for whom progress simply isn't a reality. So while life certainly isn't easy in most parts of Nigeria, it's life on the fringes that can be particularly difficult, and it's on the fringes that we find all manner of rebel groups, internecine conflicts, and separatist insurgencies. For this conversation today, we've got to step away from cities like Lagos and Abuja, toward the nation's rural areas, to its many peripheries, and the areas where government forces are at their weakest. We'll start in the nation's northeast, and we'll move clockwise so that we can hit each of the nation's ongoing conflicts one by one. While we won't be diving into the histories of these conflicts at length, we do recommend that you let us know in the comments if you'd like to see a deep dive on any particular one. We do read all the comments, and we do tend to make videos based on them. In the northeast, we begin with an insurgency that we suspect you'll recognize: Boko Haram. Fighting a continuous armed insurgency since July of 2009, Boko Haram is a militant jihadist organization with the objective of overthrowing the Nigerian government and replacing it with a regime based on the group's ultra-strict interpretations of Sharia law. While Boko Haram is active in Cameroon, Niger, and Chad, it's northeastern Nigeria that's always been the group's center and has since become its launchpad for all manner of terror attacks and insurgent offensives. The The group has gained notoriety for its exceptionally brutal attacks against civilians, its mass kidnappings of women and girls, and its fighting strength, typically estimated to command upward of 10,000 fighters at any given time, or perhaps even multiple tens of thousands. Over 2 million people have been internally displaced in Nigeria as a result of Boko Haram, while the total death toll as a result of their actions, including both people they've killed directly and people who've died as a result of famines, crackdowns, disease, and other byproducts of the violence, runs well into the multiple hundreds of thousands. But Nigeria's troubles in the northeast don't stop with Boko Haram. Instead, we've also got to talk about the Islamic State West Africa Province, locally known as ISWAP. The organization is a splinter group, first distinguishing itself from Boko Haram in 2016, and since then, it's become an exceptionally dangerous threat across the wider region. Like Boko Haram, ISWAP operates internationally, targeting nations from Chad to Cameroon to Benin, Burkina Faso, and more, and it's been instrumental in building a wider network of Islamic State branches across the entire Sahel region, located just south of the Sahara. Estimated to command anywhere from 4,000 fighters to 7,000 or more at any given time, ISWAP has fought brutal intergroup battles against Boko Haram while notching a long series of victories against the Nigerian military. It's been able to present itself as a local leader in territory it controls, although it's recently seemed to drop its hearts and minds approach towards civilians, now attacking these groups with all the regularity and destructive intent of any other jihadist insurgency. Heading southward, we find an ongoing insurgency in the Nigerian southeast, where a separatist group known as the Indigenous People of Biafra have waged a war against the Nigerian government for over 4 years now. Fighting through a paramilitary wing called the Eastern Security Network, who, to their credit, certainly have one of the cooler-looking flags floating around the wider world of separatist insurgencies, the Biafra separatists are a successor movement to the Republic of Biafra, a partially recognized state that tried to break away in the late 1960s via the Nigerian Civil War. After decades of subsequent instability, Biafra separatism has made a major comeback, with several Biafra insurgencies fighting side by side against the Nigerian government. The death toll over the last several years is difficult to pin down, but raids and skirmishes are common, and Biafra militants fight against not only the Nigerian government, but local bandits, criminal groups, and other organizations that work to take advantage of the chaos. Moving through the relatively more stable southwesterly region near Lagos, we come to the northwest, where the dangers posed by organized gangs and banditry rose to a whole new level. In this part of the country, bandit groups can, at times, leverage military-grade equipment, partly due to past captures of kit from the Nigerian military, and partly due to their access to border smuggling networks across the Sahel region. They'll frequently raid and loot villages, killing occupants as they see fit, while stealing cattle, kidnapping and ransoming local residents, and preying on travelers in remote or secluded areas. The region is home to some 60 million people, where polling by the United Nations suggests that some 8 out of every 10 residents consider banditry the greatest threat to their communities, even despite high food insecurity in that same area. The groups are relatively anonymous, highly mobile, and typically seem to have few ambitions other than simply extorting as much wealth as they can. Well over 500,000 people have been displaced, mass kidnappings and farm and mine takeovers becoming more common, and the annual death toll has risen into the multiple thousands, with no sign that the rate of violence will slow down. The Nigerian government has done a very poor job intervening as rural areas become more dangerous, hospitals and clinics are looted more frequently, and food grows ever more scarce. The result has been profound and growing instability in a region where relief seems to be a faraway prospect. And finally, we turn to the Middle Belt, a vast swath in central Nigeria that's been ravaged for multiple decades by a conflict between farming communities and herding groups. On one side of the fighting are the Fulani, nomadic or semi-nomadic and primarily Muslim herders. They raise livestock and travel around the region, grazing those animals wherever they can. On the other are a range of ethnic groups, both Christians and Muslims, who live a more sedentary life, tending to farmland and living in rural communities. While the conflict does have a distinctly religious component to it, and it's been classed as genocide against Christians by Genocide Watch since 2022, it's not solely or even primarily a religious matter. Instead, the crux of the issue is the availability of arable farmland, which has become more scarce after long-lasting and repeated droughts, desertification, and other environmental problems. That's brought farmers and herders into contact far more frequently, trying to use the same limited land to feed their own communities. As each group's population grows larger, weapons spread on the black market, and religion, while sometimes a primary motivator of violence, is always a convenient enough pretext when groups consider violence for other reasons. Many thousands of people have died over the years, and massacres are relatively common. Even that long list of ongoing conflicts doesn't tell the whole story here. Home to well over 350 ethnic groups, Nigeria sees constant low-grade fighting in one area or another, between groups with their own long-held animosity and local stresses all across the country. It's also a launchpad for a number of insurgencies in other nations. Just take Cameroon's Abazonia War between the Cameroonian government and English-speaking separatist groups that find safe harbor on Nigerian soil. Northern regions see intermittent spillover from other conflicts in the Sahel region, and many of the nation's own armed groups like Boko Haram and its many gangs of bandits aren't conveniently constrained by geography. All the while, the nation is buffeted by a constant barrage of droughts, poor crop yields, floods, spikes in inflation, political crises, and deadly diseases. With so many shocks to the system all at once, communities are getting poorer and more vulnerable while chaos only spreads, and with it, opportunities for bad actors all across Nigeria will take advantage. And just before we continue with today's video, do want a quick plug for a new channel that we have just launched, and it's called Political Fronts. Obviously, it deals with politics in the same way that we deal with war here. Trying not to have any bias, thinking things through, and just making everything hopefully easy to access. We're going to provide a link to it below, and also while you're down there, you know what else? You'll find a link to our weekly newsletter. In fact, twice weekly newsletter now. Both of these things are completely free, and they will just keep you up to date with regards to war, conflict, and politics. Like I say, links below, and now back to it. All right. Already, it should be fairly obvious that Nigeria is not doing great, but unfortunately, a quick glance at the runtime of today's episode should indicate that there is a lot more to talk about. In particular, we've got to take a look at recent outbreaks of violence all across the nation. That's because although each individual region within Nigeria might have experienced worse flare-ups in recent years than what's happening now, Nigeria's overall security situation is showing signs of rapid, nationwide deterioration. Again, we'll begin with Boko Haram, where the governor of Nigeria's Borno state warned in early April that the terror group was in the process of making a regional comeback. Borno State has been the epicenter of the Boko Haram conflict for quite some time, and it was in Borno State where Boko Haram's 2014 kidnapping of hundreds of schoolgirls gave the jihadist insurgency its global notoriety. According to the regional governor, and backed by international sources covering the conflict, Boko Haram has engaged in a wide range of attacks in early 2025. Those attacks have targeted security infrastructure, including military bases and barracks, but also civilian communities, where Boko Haram is clearly looking to expand its sphere of control. As the governor described, ambushes, attacks, and kidnappings are now taking place, quote, almost on a daily basis without confrontation. That is to say, Nigeria's security forces have been unable to intervene. The governor himself was targeted in one Boko Haram attack where the group attempted to ambush his convoy, albeit unsuccessfully. Before that, back in January, the group was suspected of killing at least 40 farmers elsewhere in Borno. The group has abducted judges, professors, security officials, and more, and it's engaged in widespread assaults on civilian areas, both to punish local communities and to place pressure on the Nigerian military from all directions. In March, the group used Nigeria as a launchpad for an attack in Cameroon that killed 20 soldiers and destroyed much of their local bases. In April, a pair of attacks left at least 22 people dead, and an assault by a splinter faction killed at least 15 locals in an area where they've now attained near complete local control. In May, Boko Haram launched attacks on multiple military bases with impunity, and suspected members of the group killed at least 23 farmers and fishermen in a single attack on a small village. Most recently, at the time of writing, the jihadists massacred at least 57 people in a pair of villages on May the 19th. Over 100 other people were disappeared in the attack, according to eyewitness accounts, and more than 70 are officially recorded as missing. The villagers who were targeted in this particular attack have been accused of being informants for ISWAP. And speaking of the Islamic State franchise, ISWAP's own attacks have picked up in frequency and in scale over the last few months. In March, the group reportedly massacred anywhere from 40 to 100 farmers in a single attack on 2 villages, while over the course of that same month, they overran at least a dozen outposts and minor positions controlled by the Nigerian military. That surge has continued through April and May, bringing down large military camps based in population centers via complex nighttime attacks that have included diversionary assaults to cut off and distract reinforcements. ISWAP is rapidly gathering weapons and ammunition, it's becoming more proficient in its use of unmanned bomb-dropping drones, and it's become an increasingly stable branch of the global Islamic State insurgency, making it a likely candidate to receive an influx of important jihadist leaders displaced from their previous strongholds in Somalia. Most recently, at the time of writing, ISWAP pulled off multiple attacks against Nigerian and Cameroonian military camps in mid-May, overrunning an entire battalion on one occasion and stealing no fewer than 45 military vehicles. A day after that particular attack, ISWAP launched a wave of simultaneous assaults against several bases. The group has become highly effective in capturing and keeping control of civilian areas, and it appears to be advancing and diversifying its tactics too rapidly for the Nigerian military to keep up. Unfortunately for Nigeria, ISWAP is no longer the only Islamic State branch working to set up shop. Another faction affiliated with the Islamic State Sahel province has recently popped up in the northwest, starting with a creeping infiltration of communities late last year. Since that time, the group has carried out over a dozen notable attacks while setting up smuggling and transport networks that will allow it to mutually support the ISWAP organization. In the nation's middle belt, dominated by farmer-herder conflicts, things are just as bad. In the most recent outbreak of violence, starting in April of this year, several consecutive massacres have left well over 100 civilians dead. In the first attack, well over 50 members of farming communities were killed across 6 villages by suspected herding groups, with about 2,000 more villagers displaced. Weeks later, another attack killed at least 51 across 2 villages, where homes were burned to the ground over the course of a brutal assault. Those attacks both took place in Nigeria's Plateau state, but the violence spread shortly afterward to the neighbouring Benue state. There, also in mid-April, at least 56 people were slaughtered in a large-scale attack, and in another assault in early May, another 23 people were killed in attacks on 4 separate villages. Again, these are only the large-scale attacks that result in massacres. Smaller-scale deadly encounters happen frequently all across the Middle Belt too. In nearly every case, whether we're discussing a large-scale massacre or an individual killing, Nigerian soldiers and law enforcement have shown an inability to respond in time or respond effectively. And elsewhere across Nigeria, insurgent groups and criminal factions have taken full advantage of the chaos. In the southern states, where the Biafra insurgency is active, an attack in early May left at least 30 travelers dead and their vehicles set ablaze just days after Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu came to the area to visit. Less than 2 weeks later, Biafra insurgents set up a roadblock and launched another attack, killing anywhere from 15 to 30 people in the process. Armed gangs and bandit groups have had considerable success of their own, with a long list of high-casualty attacks in just the 2 months before this episode was written. That includes at least 19 dead in an ambush and livestock rustling attack in the nation's northeast, while the northwest saw 21 government-backed militiamen killed in an ambush, at least 15 farmers massacred in another attack, and no fewer than 20 killed in an assault on a gold mining village. Again, these are just the biggest recent attacks, not an exhaustive list. Smaller-scale attacks, ambushes, targeted killings, extortion, kidnapping, and insurgent-controlled local governments are all a fact of life, and the Nigerian government has thus far shown little ability to directly intervene. Now, at this stage in the episode, we trust that you're getting the idea about what's been happening all across Nigeria. It's worth emphasizing one more time, however, that this isn't nearly an exhaustive list of attacks within the last few months. Just during the time it took to write this episode, there were several attacks reported in various parts of Nigeria, with a death toll over 5 in each instance, not to mention all the smaller scale attacks that certainly took place but went unreported beyond local press. And we've been working to illustrate the scale as well as the scope of the violence, because it's time that we come to the overarching problem facing Nigeria. At a moment when the nation and its people desperately need relief, the cavalry simply isn't coming. Now, the first and most obvious problem is a logistical one. Nigeria's military is stretched thin, forced to spread its 230,000 active duty troops all across the nation. As a result, they struggle to deploy anywhere in large numbers, they're only able to launch counter-offensives infrequently, and when they do, they often struggle to get access to the heavy weaponry or air support that might help to ensure victory. They're also at an information disadvantage, with both the nation's security forces and its law enforcement under-resourced and unequipped to track down a range of asymmetric groups that are excellent at disappearing into the landscape. They're dealing with adversaries that are dissimilar to each other in terms of their tactics, their ideologies, and their motivations. Finally, each of these adversary groups have the initiative within the conflict zone, whether it's Boko Haram or ISWAP or bandits or anybody else. They've got the flexibility, the freedom, and the desire to attack Nigeria's military and its civilians as they see fit. Meanwhile, the military must maintain a defensive posture, keep to defensible positions, and then use those positions to protect the civilian population. Just as problematic, if not even more so, is the fact that the Nigerian military can be far from a protective force at times. One investigative report in particular, published by Reuters in 2022, implicated Nigerian soldiers in the use of widespread violence against communities victimized by Boko Haram. That included mass mandatory abortions for women and girls who were impregnated by the group's fighters, and the routine extermination of children who were the descendants of Boko Haram fighters or their allies. Human rights organizations have thoroughly documented abuses by Nigerian forces, including regular extrajudicial killings and the widespread use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. As recently as 2024, Nigeria's military was accused of detaining mothers and their children for years at a time because of their perceived association with Boko Haram, sometimes due to legitimate connections and sometimes based on questionable, false, or non-existent evidence. In 2023, another report accused the Nigerian Air Force of regularly conducting indiscriminate bombing runs against civilians in areas associated with the farmer-herder conflict, the ISWAP and Boko Haram insurgencies, and elsewhere. Morale is low, accountability scarce, pay is insufficient, clan and ideological divides run deep. After so many years of multidimensional insurgency, everybody in the conflict zones of Nigeria has scores to settle, including soldiers who are supposed to be able to put those personal and community grievances aside. Zoom outward even further, and the questionable conduct of the Nigerian military is made all the worse by the fact that there's nobody at the top. Nigeria's military leadership and its government are fundamentally corrupt, including in ways that directly damage the country's ability to protect its own people. Troops are underpaid and under-equipped because the money to pay for their wages and equipment is embezzled away. Logistical chains are shaky in the best of times and can crumble in short order when they come under attack by adversaries that understand the value of disruption. Unit commanders pass off their responsibilities to local militias, high-end leaders pass off their responsibilities to the unit commanders, and the nation's leaders frequently decline to investigate problems they have the power to address. The nation's corruption problems run far deeper than just the military, with Transparency International ranking Nigeria 140th out of 180 nations in terms of its ability to control the problem. That corruption leads to atrophy everywhere and makes areas experiencing food shortages, public fund misappropriations, administrative negligence, or infrastructure decay all the more likely to be the target of further violence. The nation's leader is unpopular and has faced heavy public criticism. That means that corrupt elites who benefit from his rule, including a fair portion of his own government, have real incentives to engage in the shady dealings necessary to keep him in power. And as long as those elites can protect their own base of support in major cities like Lagos and Abuja, their self-interest doesn't lead them to devote the same time and effort when it comes to protecting the rural communities that are most impacted by this crisis. The battlefield successes that Nigerian soldiers do achieve can often be impressive by the numbers, but their victories are isolated in the best of circumstances. Take, for example, a joint military operation in the northwest of the country in mid-April, where a prominent bandit leader was killed along with about 100 of his fighters and followers. That Nigerian operation was a counterattack after the bandits had taken 43 villagers into a local forest, and it was accompanied by the destruction of several other bandit camps in the area. Yet despite the eye-catching death toll, the killings did little to tamp down on the everyday violence of the area, and there's a chance that the bandit leader in question wasn't actually killed at all. The Nigerian Air Force declared him dead in 2022 after a similar attack, and if he wasn't dead then, it certainly isn't assured that he's dead now. The same situation tends to play out again and again whenever Nigerian forces do seize the initiative and carry out some form of counterattack. Whenever and wherever that happens, it just isn't enough, even if the soldiers responsible carry themselves with all the professionalism that would be expected of most militaries. And while Nigeria does receive some international support, it's not the sort of thing that's particularly effective in aiding crackdowns against these kinds of threats. Western powers have been hesitant to boost Nigeria's military strength, fearing that any funds and resources they send will be exploited by the same cycles of endemic corruption that have arguably brought the nation to this point. Nearby nations like Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad have complex relationships with Nigeria and aren't always willing or competent collaborators in dealing with transnational threats. Now, to be fair, Nigeria isn't great at transnational operations either. Instead, it's more frequently been safe territory for insurgent groups to plan and launch attacks into Chad, Cameroon, and other neighbors. Russia sends support to Nigeria and has vowed to step that support up, but Russia's ability to support partners in Africa is not particularly robust right now. Nor would Moscow's preference to send hardware or a few hundred military advisors be the sort of help that would dig Nigeria out of its current security predicament. Finally, while a major Chinese defense company did recently ink a contract with Nigeria to produce ammunition, provide technical expertise, and service military equipment, those acts of assistance are several steps short of what Nigeria would need in order to turn the tide. To call a nation a failed state, or a failing state in this case, is admittedly a bold proclamation. At this point, though, we'd hope that it's clear to see why we're comfortable taking the leap. If Nigeria were dealing with just one or two of the many simultaneous insurgencies it's fighting, the label might not fit. If the nation possessed a competent, reliable, trustworthy military, or was ruled by responsible actors with interests that align with the protection of their people, then the label might not fit in that case either. If Nigeria could rely on a robust defense relationship with an international backer, then even if the label of failing state did fit, it might not be quite so relevant. But Nigeria is dealing with so many overlapping and asymmetric insurgencies, and they're all gaining in strength and stepping up frequency of their attacks. They're attacking a nation where the military and the wider government has neither the resources nor the international patrons to keep them contained, and where foot soldiers and leaders at every level are instead incentivized to take advantage of the conflict in order to enrich themselves. Unfortunately for all of Nigeria, that's a combination of major overlapping problems and deeply insufficient solutions that seems to promise considerably worse times ahead. Now, to be clear, there are steps that Nigeria can take in order to make progress on individual fronts. In the battle against ISWAP, for example, the jihadists' new willingness to target civilians after several years of good relations will leave an opening for the Nigerian government. In those areas, troops can pick up some support from locals who've been spurned by the insurgency. In fact, in its fight against bandits, Nigeria can take its successes on the local level as opportunities to collect intelligence, track down the connections of the people Nigeria has arrested or eliminated, and slowly work its way into larger criminal networks. Where China is concerned, Nigeria can take full advantage of new ammunition production facilities and really make use of tactical and logistical advisors. But all of those are band-aid solutions for a problem that desperately needs a tourniquet. And right now it's not clear that Nigeria's leaders should be trusted to even apply the band-aid instead of trying to resell it and turn a profit. The sweeping changes that would really set Nigeria on a different path aren't particularly likely to materialize. The nation's president and his inner circle are unlikely to give up power just on principle, especially when they and their allies in Nigerian society stand to enrich themselves with every day they spend in office. The nation's military has few incentives to crack down on its own severe abuses, when those abuses are not only widespread across their armed forces, but come with the express endorsement of many military leaders. The communities that have been ravaged by both insurgent groups and the Nigerian military are not about to forget what the Nigerian government has done to them, especially when the military's past conduct would seem to prove that they're hardly better than the jihadists or the raiders. And speaking of those jihadists and raiders, the Nigerian military isn't able to get to their strongholds even if they were perfectly willing to try. There aren't enough fight-ready troops to spare in order to perform those operations in more than a couple of areas at once, and every additional soldier that Nigeria commits to one element of this multidimensional conflict is another soldier who isn't on hand to deter attacks elsewhere. And even that assumes that Nigeria's military has any deterrent effect at all, an idea that's hard to justify given these insurgent groups' willingness to attack the military directly. A nation that deals with an internal security threat isn't necessarily a failed or failing state. In fact, a nation that deals with several internal security conflicts at once isn't necessarily a failing state either. But this is a nation that deals with an internal security conflict that it can't seem to stop, where every insurgent group is gaining ground. It's a nation where neither the government nor the military seems to feel as if it has any compelling incentive to step up their counterinsurgent work at the expense of their own interests. For the insurgents, the scale of the violence, the rate of atrocities, the extent of land capture, and the tactical ability to achieve their goals are all escalating. Nothing about Nigeria's political or security apparatus is rising to meet that challenge. If anything, the nation's military appears to be in a state of decay, while its government is transparent only about its desire for blatant self-enrichment. All the while, it's ordinary people who are trampled by armed forces on all sides. Yet even that human destruction doesn't seem to be enough to motivate Nigeria to step up. As of now, all signs point to a Nigeria on the brink, not just a nation that's under-equipped to deal with the challenges it faces, but a state that is systematically unable to break itself out of a self-destructive cycle. Until and unless that changes, Nigeria must be understood as a failing nation, but a nation can't be in the process of failing forever. Sooner or later, nations in freefall will hit rock bottom. So let's hope that Nigeria and its 230 million souls can find a way out before that happens. Thank you for watching.